So the first is on agrarian change lessons from India and China. It's Michael Roberts.
By your conference on agrarian change to present a paper. Unfortunately, I cannot present this paper physically in presence with the rest of you. It's a long way to India, and I haven't been able to fit a visit in to do that, as I've got another conference on at the same time. So I apologize for that. However, I hope this recording will provide some information about how I see things in terms of agrarian change in the 2020s. In particular, I'm going to look and contrast the position that has developed in the Indian rural sector against the Chinese rural sector over the last few decades and going forward. To do that, I want to present a few graphs to you, and I'm going to try and share those now with you on this recording. Agrarian change, the lessons of India and China. And what I really want to talk about are three key things which I think have demonstrated the difference between what has happened to the Chinese agricultural sector and rural population compared to India over the last few decades. So, up until the early 1990s, there was hardly any difference in terms of agricultural production in China and India. But in the last 30 odd years, China has taken substantially bigger strides forward compared to India. In my view, there are three main reasons for this. First, thoroughgoing land reform was achieved in China way back in the end of the revolution in 1949 and beyond, particularly up until the 1970s, with public ownership of large proportions of the land and the redistribution of that land to the peasants in the area, the abolition of landlordism, in effect. While in India, inequality in land ownership has remained significant and pretty much unchanged over the last 30 or 40 years. Secondly, industrialization and urbanization have boosted employment, particularly for women in China, moving out of the rural areas into the cities and into manufacturing, and that's dramatically lowered poverty rates. But in India, female employment participation remains relatively low, both particularly in the urban areas and in industry, while poverty rates remain high, particularly in rural areas, and inequalities of income and wealth have widened over the past 40 years in particular. And third, it's planning. China's state-led planning with high levels of public investment into agricultural infrastructure, health and education in the rural areas has enabled not only rural incomes to improve, but also the productivity of agricultural production in the rural areas compared to India, where India is still adopting increasingly a free market approach to the question of the distribution of agricultural investment and on the question of moving from the rural to the urban areas. If we look at the current position, we can see a very sharp difference between the level of agricultural production in China compared to India, with populations which are not dissimilar at the moment. China's agricultural production is some 3 times larger than India's, which is larger than the US in total, and larger, of course, than many other so-called emerging economies and those economies that have more levels of agricultural production. China is the biggest agricultural producer in the world. It's a very big population, but also it's 3 times larger in production than India's. And why is that? Well, if we look first of all at the productivity or crop yield, if you want to measure it, of agricultural production, we can see that China has quite a high level of crop yield kilos per hectare compared to India. Nearly twice as much, not quite, but something like 80% higher than India's crop yield per hectare. India's is below Brazil's, below Argentina's, if above Russia's. Of course, the United States has the highest level of productivity in the agricultural sector, but China's is not that far behind considering its position in the world economy. And there's a big difference then between China and India on crop yield and therefore on the productivity per hectare of agricultural production. What are the reasons for this? One of the big reasons is that average farm size in India is just over 1 hectare, which is really small compared to 180 hectares in the United States and over 3 hectares in China. And that farm size has been falling gradually over the last 50 or 60 years. The figures we have in the 2010s of just over 1 hectare for India, but actually it's probably dropping below that. So what we're getting is a high top layer of big efficient producers with landowners and a vast majority of larger subsistence farming, shackling the majority of the agricultural population of farmers to very low levels of production and therefore low levels of income to be earned. And there's no attempt to reorganize the farm ownership ratios in India, whereas in China, that landlord reform has already taken place many decades ago. And if we see the position when it comes to the rural population and its growth, one of the things we notice, even in the 21st century, that India is still expanding its rural population. That's not been the case in China. People have left the countryside in increasing numbers. The population in the rural areas is falling, and as Chinese people generally move towards the cities, into industry and other services based in the cities, out of the agricultural sector, without necessarily a loss in agricultural production, as we've seen. On the other hand, in India, there's been only until very, very recently can we now talk about an end to an increase in rural population. I think that shows, in a, if you want, a counterfactual way, that the productivity of agriculture in China remains much higher than in India, and India still has up till very recently relied upon just having more people working in the agricultural sector on low wages with low productivity. And if we look at the rate of urbanization, it's really staggering what has happened in China compared to India. If I can point out to you that India back in 1960, the share of population that lived in urban areas was just about 18%, and in China it was just a little bit more at 19%. In fact, if you go through the next few decades, in the 1980s, India had 23% of people in urban areas, and China had less than that, nice 19% of people in urban areas. It was only then we had the dramatic process from the 1990s of expansion in the urban population in China. China now has 59% of the population, as in 2018, in urban areas, while India has grown its share of urban population, but still is only 34%. And is well behind many other Asian economies as a result, while India is way, way behind China. And the World Bank's estimated now that India's urban population is around 535 million, or 37%, while China's is 923 million, or 66% of the population. Thus, while India has urbanized at an average growth rate of 2.7% per decade, China has logged an average growth rate of urbanization of 7.3% average annual growth, the fastest urbanization rate the world has ever seen. And I think that makes a difference, because it means that it stagnates rural wages in a country where there's not increased urbanization opportunities for other employment. And as a result, there's a high level of number of people still in the rural population in India, and therefore wages are suppressed. We've seen rural wages rise in India in the last 10 years or so by 58%, but in China, they've risen by 95%. So although people are leaving the land, going into the cities, those that are left are not just old people, but people who are also working with better equipment, with state support, and are able to get higher wages. And that's demonstrated, I think, in general. We see that the real problem in India is that to go into the urban areas doesn't guarantee you a job anymore. Manufacturing sector growth is stalling, except in a few states. And that means that labor that is released from agriculture is not getting absorbed by the market in the cities. And we have a general position where there's no real support for the rural population in India compared to China. Child nutrition, maternal health, and infant mortality are far worse in India, behind even those of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And India's spending on health as a percentage of GDP remains half of China's. That can only damage the productivity of the agricultural sector and the people living there. And that's the issue, I think. Some people talked about in the past premature industrialization, in other words, as people, the economy begins to decline, even in the manufacturing sector, before people have actually expanded and into employment in manufacturing. So what we get in India now is a fall in agriculture and manufacturing employment. The bottom left graph here shows that agriculture had 22% of employment back in the beginning of the 2000, beginning of this century. That it's fallen now to 21%. On the other hand, manufacturing, which was around about 28% at the beginning of the century, has also fallen to 25% in India. So there is an increasing connection between falling agricultural employment and falling manufacturing employment. Whereas everybody they're going into low-level productivity areas like trade and hotels, and only a small bit, of course, into for the better off skilled people in the cities, in the financial sector and other areas. And of course, the public sector has increased dramatically, doubling its sense in defense and other services. But in the productive sectors of the economy, which is agriculture and manufacturing, generally, these are the productive sectors. Employment has fallen in those areas and therefore made it impossible for really big improvements in agricultural and manufacturing production in India. And if we look at rural employment for women, that's improved a little bit since the end of the pandemic slump in 2020. It's jumped back a bit, but even so, even if we look at that, we can see that urban employment has moved up a little bit. There's been a fairly jump in rural employment for women, and the unemployment rate is still much higher, though, in the urban area than it is in the rural area, but also falling. So what we've got here is some improvement in the rural conditions, particularly for the female labour force, but not in the urban areas, where there's been a very gradual change, so that people are stuck on the working on the land because the opportunities for moving to the cities remain limited. And part of the reason for this is, of course, that incomes in the urban areas of India are way out of line with the incomes and wealth of the very richest people in India. India has the richest 10% of Indians have 77% of national wealth, while the poorest 60% have just 4.7%, and they will generally be, of course, in the rural areas. So this is a huge inequality, with the richest 1% having over 50% of the personal wealth in Indian economy and society. And average incomes are falling well behind those of China as a result. We can see here measurements, 100 is the point where that's India's average income as measured by World Inequality Database, and the red dots line is the growth of average incomes in China compared to India's average income, and also of Vietnam's in the blue dots. So back in 1960, the difference between the Chinese and Indian average incomes was pretty close, not much difference. But now, the average income in China, average incomes in China as of 2022 are 250%, 250 compared to 100% for India. A massive move in rise in incomes for Chinese people, both rural and urban, compared to India. And even Vietnam is doing better than India. And that inequality of income shares is shown so graphically in these two graphs. First of all, on the income side, you can see that apart from South Africa, India has the highest inequality in income shares, with the top 10% having nearly 58% of all income in India, and the top 1% having nearly 23% of all income. And note, that is even higher than the United States or South Africa. The top 1% have an extremely high level of income share compared to all the other possible countries there. China at 15% compared to India's 23%. And if you look at wealth, a similar extreme inequalities exist. Again, South Africa is the most unequal country in wealth terms, but if you look at just the top 1%, you can see that, again, India has a very high level of 40%, 1% owning 40% of all the wealth, 10% owning 65% of all the wealth. Somewhat different figures from the previous ones, but still gives you the same inequalities rate. And compared to China, that is considerably worse, at least at the 1% level. So we're seeing a real problem here that things cannot really change when this structure of the economy is so unequally organized. It makes it very difficult, not just for rural workers to improve their conditions, but generally for Indian working people to improve them. India remains far more unequal than China does. And here's the trend we can see in the share of national income. As I say, back in 1980 on this occasion, the top 10% of India and the top 1% of India are down here. That's the 1% for India, and the 1% for China is down there in the red, and the 10% share is up here. They were pretty much the same back in 1980. Now you can see the dark blue dots for India, that the income share of the top 10% is way, way higher than it is for the top 10% for China. And on wealth too, India is more unequal than China. That situation can only make things more difficult to really bring about agrarian change. Finally, my other main point, and this is a key one I think, is that what we have in China in terms not only of agriculture but also we know of manufacturing, a planned economy, the attempt to plan and provide a strategy not only for industry but also for agriculture through state investment, through local planning and national planning, through support on various infrastructure services that rural areas need just as much as the urban areas do. And that has led to the ability for Chinese agriculture to be much more efficient and develop, and yet rural incomes to rise even more. To explain this graph here, first of all, if we look at the angled dots here, that's the amount of public stock to GDP that China has, which is 1.5 times GDP. You compare that to India, which is about 0.6 of GDP, and the Western countries are even lower in terms of their share of public sector stock to GDP. Then if you look at the investment to GDP, look to public and private relationship. So in China, which is the thin dot line here, you can see that the public sector is way, way bigger in terms of stock to private investment stock, something like close to 3 times larger, while in India it's again about 0.6 and even lower in some of the Western countries. And the right-hand scale gives you the figure for the investment to GDP ratios in these countries. So China's investment to GDP ratio for public investment, not all investment, but just public investment, is 16-17% of GDP, just way, way higher than any other country in the world, really, a major country anyway, while India's is around 4%, and then you have the US and UK down 2 or 3%. So China's public sector investment is more than 3 times bigger than it is in India, and more than 4 or 5 times bigger than it is in the Western economies. I think that's a key factor in driving agrarian change and improvement of conditions for rural workers and agricultural productivity. So again, in conclusion, in my view, the reason for the difference between China and India's agricultural development in the last 40 years has been, first of all, thoroughgoing land reform in India, while in China, while in India, inequality in land ownership remains significant. Second, industrialization and urbanization have boosted employment, particularly for women in China, and dramatically lowered poverty rates, while in India, although female employment participation has improved recently, it still remains low, and poverty rates remain high, and inequalities in wealth and income have widened significantly in the last 40 years. And third, China's state planning and state investment has led to higher rates of investment in agricultural infrastructure, in rural health and education, and that makes a big difference to the ability of the agricultural sector to improve and for rural working people to gain from that. Those are my main conclusions. Unfortunately, I'm not available to answer any questions or disagreements on these points that I've made, but I hope if you want to make some, you will be able to do that by sending me an email, and the organizer of the conference will give you my email address if you wish to take this further in the discussion. But I hope this has at least been somewhat useful for achieving what you are doing at the conference, and good luck with the other panels. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I invite the speakers of the panel to come on stage, and I will let Jayan sort of take over and talk about aspirations and realities in rural India behind you to remind you of that.
Good morning to you all. Thank you, FAS, for giving me this opportunity. In fact, I would be, building on some of the points Professor Michael Roberts just mentioned about infrastructure and so on. As already mentioned, this paper is some of my findings on long-term changes in India, in labor market, with respect to employment, education, and aspirations. Much of this work is based on secondary data, employment surveys, national sample surveys, and PLFS, periodic labor force surveys. But I also added some insights of the work I've been doing with my colleagues on migration and some other areas. So what you see here is, I'm not so sure whether this is visible to all at the end, activity status as seen from the employment surveys over a long period of time, from 1983 to 2023. Activity status means rural men in the age group of 15 to 29 years. What proportion of these rural men are employed? What proportion of them are unemployed? What proportion of them are out of the labor force, and students? So you can see, in fact, at least 3 generations of Indians here. Those who are 15 to 29 in 1983, more than 60% of them were in agriculture. But by 23, almost 2 generations after, 40 years later, 25% of these young men are in agriculture. It's a gradual decline, not a very sharp decline. What you also see here is a big change in the blue part, in the light blue part, which is students. 13%, now 34% of all young men in the age group of 15 to 29 years, so either high school or colleges, attending high schools or colleges. In fact, this is one of the points that I want to make, not just among young men, but also among young women. We see a rise in enrollment in education. You can see that among women or girls in the 15 to 29 age group, only 6% were in a school or college in 1983, but now it is 30%, as large as. In fact, the gap between girls and boys in enrollment in education has almost narrowed down, very little. But what we expect typically when you have, at least 2 generations, increasing proportions are in schools and colleges, you expect more and more of these people who are studying in schools and colleges to also move into regular jobs. You don't really see that here. So that is the anomaly. Here you have the 15 to 29 and the 30 to 59 years. The numbers may not be visible. What you see in both is a decline in the dark blue, which is agriculture, but almost stagnant, the yellow part, which is the proportion of young and older men in regular jobs. So at least you should see an improvement in the proportion of older men in regular jobs, because you have a very large proportion, almost more than 30% of the young people, 15 to 29 in schools and in colleges. So the expansion in regular jobs has been very little. What has expanded while agriculture's share has declined is non-agriculture. I see as is industry, construction, and services, but mostly casual jobs or self-employment in these sectors. So that has been the change has happened. When it comes to girls and women, even here you see this decline in the proportion of young girls and older women in agriculture, and an increase, a very encouraging increase in the proportion of these in students, in education. You naturally expect an improvement in employment status, more of them in regular jobs, but you don't really see that. In fact, even among younger women, we see the green here, which is those who are engaged or who report their status as attending to domestic duties is very, very large. 50% in 2018-19, it has declined, and correspondingly labor force participation in female labor force participation has increased, but I will come to it in a minute. So about, again, there have been a lot of discussion in the last 2 days about women's participation in the labor force. Here, if you just look at the last, you can see the dark blue, which is agriculture, self-employed in agriculture as unpaid helpers. So the dark blue at the bottom is what you see here, different times. And then you see the yellow and the green are out of the labor force, attending domestic duties, 92. Then 93 is attending domestic duties as well as engaged in free collection of goods such as vegetables and so on. Again, please look at this. And the brown part is women who are self-employed in agriculture, not as unpaid helpers, but so what I'm trying to say here is while you see a change, while we see an increase in women who are part of the labor force, much of this increase is of women who report their status as unpaid helpers in agriculture, not in any regular jobs, not even in any casual jobs or self-employed in non-agricultural sectors. So in fact, there is very little change in the status of women's employment, only somewhat of a definitional change between 93 and self-employed unpaid helpers. So what do all these changes mean? In terms of wage rates, Professor Usami and Arindam gave a presentation 2 days back. But different from the trends in WRRI, what we find here is, as well known, the period from 2004 to 2011 was a period of very fast growth of rural wages. But then the period from 2011 to 2019 was a period of a decline in rural wages. But the period after 2019, the post-COVID period, the PLFS data actually show an improvement in the growth of rural wages, which is different from the trends from WRRI. Although at the same time, there's a deceleration in the earnings of regular workers and the self-employed. Now, what could this mean? One possible reason is that there's been an increase over the years in government expenditures. And when we mean government expenditures, it's largely state government expenditures on social sectors and also on developmental expenditures. So you see here, and you see some of the changes. The first change happened in 2007-8, and the second change was in the post-COVID, there has been an increase in social spending by the state governments, not by the union government. And a revival in government spending of the COVID pandemic may have helped to alleviate the livelihood crisis in the country caused due to the slow growth of rural incomes and employment. But then we know this is certainly not the best of conditions. As we've seen, a very large segment of India's rural workers are engaged as migrant workers in urban areas, with my colleagues, we did a study on migrant workers in 4 different locations in Ludhiana in Punjab, Coimbatore, and Kozhikode and Cochin in Kerala. The striking point is that all of these workers in the informal sectors, long hours of work and low wages, the 2 main things, and much of it is due to the multiple disadvantages they suffer. Many of the workers belong to social groups that have historically faced social disadvantages, scheduled castes, Muslims. They do not own land or other assets, poor education and skills, and the sheer absence of any kind of form of social security in the villages from where they come from. And of course, this is also clear from the PLFS secondary data. Workers belonging to the disadvantaged groups, you have more of them in casual jobs and fewer of them in regular jobs. All of this, while I say perhaps we may have averted a major crisis, but at the same time there is a large opportunity cost of all this. We see that India today accounts for almost 20%, 1/5 of the world's young 15 to 29 population. You can see China was in a similar position during the period from 1990 to 2010. Now, even for India, the demographic window of opportunity will only last for another 20 years. By 2040, India's population will start aging. So you have this very short period and I reiterate this point of rising enrollment in education, which is a big opportunity. Of course, it only means aspirations for better jobs, aspirations for better education. Doesn't mean the quality of education has improved. The quality of schools and colleges have improved. But it clearly shows a great, great degree of aspirations, especially among the rural poor. And you see the numbers, you just look at the numbers, you have 120 million in schools and colleges today. Now 120 million, as we know, is larger than, as big as the population of a country like Japan. So if you're thinking of a knowledge economy, this is the way to go. You have these large, huge human resources. And of course, this is much later. This should have happened much earlier, but the last 20 years, especially after 2000, we see increase in enrollment among women. In fact, a narrowing gap between girls and boys, already mentioned, but also a narrowing gap between different regions and between different social groups when it comes to education. So this is a huge opportunity. But why no increase in regular jobs? You can see the increase in jobs. Just look at, too many numbers, but if you just look at the employment in public administration and defense, which is, government jobs, it was 10.3 million in India, overall jobs in 93-94. It has declined to 8 million in 2019. You actually see a rising population. You see the government employees, the number of government employees to increase, but that has actually not happened in India. So, perhaps this is one of the reasons why our regular jobs has not increased. And this was already mentioned in the previous presentation. Now, when we compare with China, 1990, both countries were at similar levels of per capita incomes. Today, China's per capita income is 3 to 5 times higher than India's, depending on whether it's a current measure or purchasing power parity that you look at. And a lot of it has to do with the huge increase in investment in China, and a large part of that investment came from state-owned enterprises. It was mentioned in the previous. And you can see that India's opportunity loss, there's been a sharp increase in because of the trade tensions that we all see, but also because of slowing population and slowing growth of incomes in high-income countries, the market of those high-income countries.
Somebody's gone to attend to it.
Okay, yeah. I'm not doing anything. So it actually means that the future growth of developing countries like India cannot be dependent on exports. It has to be more and more dependent on the domestic market. Now, if incomes have to be dependent on the domestic market, if future growth has to be dependent on the domestic market, the domestic incomes must rise. Domestic wages must rise. We just saw that a large segment of India's workers are informal workers receiving extremely low wages. That must change. More public sector spending on subsidized housing. We heard presentations yesterday, Professor Judith here, Shamsher, about education. Investment in education, health, and other social sectors is also a way to move into a high value driven knowledge economy. One example with that I can stop here. We all know the medical entrance exam. 2.6 million, almost 2 million candidates write that exam, of which only 3% pass. But India is a country with only 0.7 doctors per 1,000 population. The figure for Cuba is 8. The figure for China, for the US, is also somewhere close to 8. For China is 2.4. So even if you're looking at the Chinese level, we need to have 1 million doctors over the, we need to substantially increase our medical education. So I'll just, so this is the point I want to make. We need an upgrading of our industrial structure. We need an upgrading of human resources if we are talking about future growth based on domestic incomes and not future growth which is based on export growth, export incomes, which look more difficult in the coming years. So public expenditures on social sectors can boost real wages and lead to wage-led growth. At the same time, we need industrial policy and public spending on research and development. In fact, again, we need to understand that this so-called demographic window of opportunity is a short window of opportunity. By 2040, you will have not a young population, but an aging population. So it's for a generation of young Indians, this is a make or break moment. We need growth with rising and not stagnant wages. And it is important that governments, and of course the private sector, but of course the government has to give the push to spend first, and instead of thinking about saving, instead of thinking about fiscal deficit, the need of the hour is spend first and saving will follow. Thank you so much.
So let's take questions, one round of questions, and I think we'll have an opportunity to have more questions at the end of the session. We'll just wait for the system to restart.
And campaign, where do you end there? What to do? I think this is very important for me. Someone could throw light on that is very important. So type of the governance system, type of the electoral system, election, whether what type it's there, direct reference to the democracy. Let me come to that one. What about the democracy? How do you keep this here in the whole debate?
Regular wages and salary household, agricultural labor households, non-agricultural labor households, and all those kind of households. So people from different household type are coming to education. Let's suppose I am from agricultural labor household and I execute some level of education. And what is happening to people like me in getting regular salary job as compared to the other people? And my second question is, in some way, what is the difference across the caste group in like coming to the education and again getting to job in aspect of the affirmative action in India? Thank you.
Have come up very significantly in terms of contribution to overall GDP. So do you agree with this view that, which many scholars quote, that the Indian scenario is in some case bypassing or jumping from, say, agriculture to services without going through the classical route from agriculture to industry to services? Thank you.
One last question. Now, studying experience, but we are, many of us, very worried about the fact that this is wasted time. There's so much quality of education is so important. And that's
Professor Judith's question was about to answer. So there was a question about services, there was a question about social and physical spend. Expenditure and Professor Judith's question about See, and also the question about manufacturing versus services. Now, I guess these are all very relevant questions for India at the moment. It's, I mean, Arvind Subramanian and Senior players have been arguing that now India actually missed the manufacturing bus. Now we should just focus only on the services. I don't fully agree with it because we need production of goods just as we produce services. But at the same time, is manufacturing going to be the labor absorbing sector in the coming years? Maybe not. The kind of labor absorption that happened in manufacturing in China, partly domestic demand, partly export demand, from the 80s, initially started in domestic demand, township and village enterprises, later catering to export demand. So that is very difficult now to replicate. Now, in fact, some of our policymakers also argue we should now try to emulate China. But trying to emulate China 20 or 30 years after China, what China did in 1980. And effectively what they're also saying is you try labor-intensive, low-wage manufacturing. I mean, that's what, the pictures I showed about migrant workers is clearly that model, labor-intensive, low-wage manufacturing. I believe the prospect of India doing well in that now is very limited. And on the partly look at the supply, look at the workers who are coming into the labor market. All the children of these migrant workers we talk to, they all want to become engineers, they want to move ahead in life. So to tell them, go back to low wage manufacturing perhaps is not an option. Manufacturing should be there, but increasingly I think we have to really think. I mean, in fact, I guess we are at a stage in development, which is why I guess this looking at the domestic market becomes very important. And we have to do it very differently from what China did, because China had this advantage, large domestic market, low inequality, as was mentioned by Professor, and a very large export demand. Now we don't have any of this. We are starting with high inequalities, so obviously the inequalities have to come down, number one. But number two, export market is not going to be the driver, given what all things are happening in the US and other places. So, which is the biggest challenge? I mean, how to increase wages and at the same time increase growth, economic growth. Typically, we think wages have to be low to have faster industrial growth. But now we are in a situation where wages have to rise, incomes have to rise. Which means you have to actually shift into high value added sectors very quickly, very short time, because that is where all these young people who are students can be accommodated. Now that's going to be very tough.
The earlier industries of the earlier era, textiles, garments, which means you have to put much more effort into R&D, research and development, which actually means you need more and more educated workers, more highly educated workers. You probably need many more PhDs. We need many more master's graduates. The kind of development which happened in the US, again, it was largely a knowledge-led revolution. So India has the potential to do that. The good thing about education and health is that expenditure on education can have both supply stimulus as well as a demand stimulus. You have more teachers, you have more doctors, but once you have these students studying from engineering colleges, you have more technologies, you have more researchers, they can build the knowledge economy of the future. So I guess that is the way to go. I think I've answered, but of course the first question about the status of employment and in fact, I'm not very different. My arguments are not very different from the arguments. Professor Usami is here. Arjun has also kind of made, Arjun and his colleague Avinash Tripadi have also made the similar arguments. I guess all of us are trying to say is there is no big structural change, especially in the media reports or the main argument is that no, look, there's been a big change in women's employment. women's participation in the workforce was falling and suddenly it has increased. But that hasn't really happened. So it is, in fact, the steady. You just have a difference in categorization. In terms of regular jobs, manufacturing jobs, there have been marginal improvements as per the latest data in 23-24, but not anything significant. So we really need a revolution in terms of employment, education, and social expenditures. Thank you.
But I think I've earned my. So I invite Mr. Mohanan to present. He'll be talking about data systems for understanding agrarian change in India. Over to you.
Good morning to all. There is no presentation in the sense that I have not done any research or anything to present some findings. I am more involved in the data collection issues. So whatever I am talking will be only related to the data aspects for studying the agrarian changes. And I generally do this because I want that the researchers and others who are actually using the data to spend more time on understanding how the data has been collected, how the data has been generated, rather than looking at what is published finally. And those issues are quite relevant in the discussion that has come up now also, especially when we talk about the women's increase in work participation. Is it because of some instructional kind of thing, or is it because of genuine change in the system of field? So these are issues which I want to stress, and specifically, so that is what I will be using this for, time for discussing now. So basically, when we talk about data set for agrarian changes or agriculture studies, we look at some of these kinds of data. One is the land and resource use data, which includes the land holding, size distribution, tenancy arrangements, irrigation and input access, land use classification, and others. Then we have the production data, which is important for the GDP estimation and other things. That is the agriculture production, crops, livestock, fisheries, and the input use, and also the marketing kind of charges and others. Then there are the agriculture prices, wage rates, cost of cultivation, value addition. And then we talk about the labor and social structure which come from the employment data, the data on employment structure such as sector-wise employment, gender division. Then there are also institutional and policy kinds of related data, that is agriculture credit, subsidies, tenancy reforms, market infrastructure, institutional arrangements. Then finally we have the environment and climatic data. Now all of them are not actually collected by the Ministry of Agriculture, they are coming from different places. But this is a total picture of the data requirement. Now if you look at the main source of data that come from the agriculture sector in or the government departments, one is the area and production data, which has been there since time immemorial, right from the Mughal times or even before that. We've been collecting the production data on agriculture. And there are systems available, though they are slightly different from state to states, land record state and non-land record states. And then we have the special cost of cultivation studies. These are mostly outsourced to universities and others. This is essential for the CC, Agriculture Prices Commission, and the National Income people. Then I come to the other three major surveys on which I will be discussing. One is the agriculture census, which we have almost every 5 years now, starting from 1970-71, which covers mostly the holding, and then there are input surveys. And then we have a livestock census, which is done by government every 5 years or 7 years kind of thing now, I think. Other thing is the national sample surveys and landholding surveys, with which I am more familiar because I spend most of my time in those surveys. And then along with that, we have the livestock holding. And recently, we have started a series of special survey of farmers. So I'll be discussing these three data sets. And the basic units reporting for these surveys are the agriculture households, and also the operational holding from households and land records. Now, basically, the broad picture that comes out is from this data, quite known. In the GDP share of the agriculture, animal husbandry and forestry, including fisheries, was something like 52% in 1950-51. It has steadily declined. Now the decline is slightly lower, but it's still around 16% of the total national economy is contributed by this agriculture sector, basically. And then correspondingly, if you look at the people engaged in agriculture, this is the share of usually employed in agriculture sector for rural men and women. I have just taken from the NSS surveys. You don't find that kind of a decline which you find elsewhere, especially for the women. Rural men, it has declined steadily from 80% in 77, 78 to around 50% now. And rural women, the decrease is much lower, 88%. Now it's still around 77%. There's an increase actually, which is what has been discussed earlier. The last survey was, it was around 75%, now it's about 77%. So it's a slight increase for women. Now these are the three surveys. One is this, as I mentioned, the land holding surveys of NSS, which is done once in 10 years. And the agriculture census once in 5 years, and the situation assessment survey. So far we had 3 surveys, and the landholding surveys is very crucial because the first time it was done was in the NSS in the very beginning in 1954-55, and there was a World Program of Agriculture Census. These two were considered together and did that survey, and again they did it in 60-61. And then the census program started separately for after 70-71. Now this specific survey requires mention here because the NSS survey in the 1955-56 was actually raised the whole agrarian issue because that survey findings were the key things, and it identified the agrarian disparities because before that there was no, India had a different system, and there was no unified, politically unified structure. So the first time we had some kind of a national picture on the agrarian disparities, and that helped the land reform movement and the guided policy formulation. And the tenancy data also was quite useful to understand the agrarian structure and the tenancy system. And the tenancy data included the land leased in and land leased out and the terms of lease and other things. And also crucially, it provided the input for designing the land reforms. In fact, the Mahalanobis himself wrote the summary of the findings in the first round. And this high concentration of land among small number of the evidence to justify the land reform movement. And in fact, some estimates are also made by Professor Mahalanobis how to redistribute the land, if the surplus land is taken, how it comes out. So this survey was quite a landmark survey in our Indian history, basically. And it also found out a little over 1/5 of the households did not own any land. And then 1/4 of all rural households less than 1 acre. So quantifying some of the land distribution structure was done after this survey. Before that, there were not very clear pictures. Now, if you summarize the findings from these surveys, this is what a very brief summary of this landholding survey shows. In 60-61, something like the operational holding, there were around 50 million, and it went up almost up to 108 in the 2012-13 survey. After that, it has been mentioned yesterday also, there is a slight decline in the number of operational holdings. In the last survey, it was only 101.98. And I think the agriculture census also shows a decline, though the magnitudes are totally different. And the area operated shows it went up, it has been showing a very steady decline because of land being put to other areas, other activities, urbanization, and many things. But the average area operated has been coming down all through. It is now 0.83 hectares from the landholding survey. So this gives a broad picture of the structure of the holdings. And then there are a little more detailed findings that comes out of the survey. The proportion of marginal holdings actually went up from 66, the proportion of marginal holdings up from 66% to 80% in 2000C. And similarly, the small holders also went up slightly, but the medium and large holders have come down. But the concentration coefficient has been very high, it remains so. The Gini coefficient is 0.73 in 61, 62, and still it is very high. But from 91, 92 survey showed a reversal of the declining trend in the incidence of tenancy, which is observed compared to the 60, 61 and 81, 82. The total leased in operated area declined from 14 million to 9 million, and then it has risen slightly to 10.5, and the last survey, it also shows a slight increase kind of thing. So the decline in tenancy perhaps is slightly changing. Then the average rural household size declined by 50% between these 2 years. But the latest figure is something like this. 2019 was the last survey done. The agriculture households have been estimated as 93 million or something like 54% of the rural households are still enumerated as agriculture households. I will come to that issue. That is the main issue, is how do you define an agriculture household and things like that. Otherwise, these numbers don't make much sense. And 74% of the agriculture households possess less than 1 hectare, and then average household came down. But among the major states, you can find certainly a big difference. Agriculture households lowest in Tamil Nadu, Kerala and AP by this definition, highest in Rajasthan, UP and MP, and the proportion is still high for hilly states and northeast. And only 71% of the agriculture households are actually self-employed in agriculture. So this is an issue which we can come later. Why is it? Is it because the way you define the agriculture households? For example, in Kerala, though we call them agriculture household, actually only 40% of the households have income from self-employment in agriculture. So this is an issue that we'll mention that. Now we have the situation assessment survey, which was actually started around the turn of this millennium, 2000. It was initially called a Millennium Survey of Indian Farmers kind of thing. So there the agriculture households have been defined in slightly different way. Agriculture production unit that produces field crops, horticulture crops and livestock, and standard definitions. And now currently they have put a condition that the value of agriculture produce should be around 4,000 from agriculture activities. It was 3,000 in the previous survey. So they used an inflation figure and got this thing. Now the question is, when the first proposal came for the situation assessment survey from the Agriculture Ministry, I was involved in that. So the first question we raised from the survey design point of view was that, who is a farmer? How do you, I mean, when you do an assessment survey of farmers, I should know who is a farmer. And there were no clear idea about who should be considered as a farmer. So after a lot of discussion, nothing came out much. So a very delicate definition was put. Anybody who does, who has some land and who does some farming, without any regard to the size or the investment or anything like that. So that was the first definition used. And that was different from agriculture household, and I think it was called a farmer household by definition of that. And then the survey result, if you look at that, it shows the crop incomes are not the major source of income, because that is coming out of that definition. It was mostly the wage and salaries from the formed of the last one. So this is for the, definitional issues is the main issue when it comes to comparing these numbers. In the agriculture production unit producing field crops, this is different from in the last SAS. And to exclude households with insignificant production, they excluded, they put this condition of 4,000, which is also a very, very restrictive thing. So if you do not have a very comparable definition of a farmer, many of the surveys will produce, the pattern comes out same, but the magnitude of the numbers are all different. So let me quickly go through the other one is the agriculture census, which is a part of the world census of agriculture. which has got a totally different methodology. What they do is they don't go to the farmer household basically, they sit with the land recorded registers which is available and try to retabulate the data from the land records. So that produces a set of numbers which are totally different from the landholding surveys basically, because it is done in the office, not in the field actually. And where village records are retabulated, and you have the Kasara kind registers in all those areas. And these are aggregated, and for non-land record state like Kerala, West Bengal and Orissa, they do a sample survey basis. And these findings, you can see the operational holdings have been increasing steadily, but these numbers are not matching with the landholding survey. It is 71 million in 70-71, now it is 146 million, whereas the landholding surveys will tell you it's about 105 million kind of thing in this. So there is a lot of difference in the operational holdings number of holding coming out from the agriculture census and the landholding surveys, and also the situational assessment surveys. And the decline is already there, I don't want to repeat those things. And other findings, these are the broad findings that come out from there. Now this divergence has been one of the major worry for us, because two surveys producing two different set of numbers, and then this has been gone into, but unfortunately nobody could resolve the reason why it is happening. Most of the feeling is that it is because of the operational thing. One is that your investigator goes to the farm households and can't find out. Other is somebody sits in the office and try to retabulate the data. So that is why you have a very large number coming from the agriculture census and the landholding surveys of that. And then some of the findings in the leased area operated was 2.2 million hectares in agriculture census, but it's only, this is only 1/4 of the about 9 million that is done the landholding survey. That is because again in the retabulation the leased details are not known to the person who is sitting there. It may actually be happening by word, without a written contract, and there may not be any official record of that. So if you look at the agriculture census data, this gives you a slightly different picture. And the size class distribution, the differences in absolute numbers are very high, but if you look at the overall distribution, it looks more or less same, which means there's a systematic bias in all through in measuring these. So this methodology and others still remain unresolved. I'll finish in another 2 minutes. Okay. So the basic issue is, as I mentioned earlier, is the issue of defining who is a farmer and then who is a farmer household. All these surveys have different methodologies and they are not very clear-cut definition. And there was a question raised in Parliament also, who is a farmer? And the government of India, the Parliament, no answer was actually given, who is a farmer. But in some of the records, they use the word, a farmer is anybody who does cultivation for sustenance in his own land or anything. And the National Commission of Farmers also defines similarly, a farmer, anyone actively engaged in economic kind of thing. But when we go to a survey kind of thing, these two definitions are actually not very useful to a surveyor, what is actively engaged. But a definition of sustenance, somebody undertaking for sustenance is more meaningful, provided we can actually quantify in terms of the household income 50% or not. But that is not currently done. So many of the findings you find, rather not very relevant kind of findings come when you ask possible questions on the farmer. What about the technology they use? From where do they get the information and other things? So you are asking many of these questions to people who are actually not farmers. So that way, when you look at the findings of these surveys, it may not be very relevant. So my advice to people is that, I was discussing with Sudha also, the right thing would be to take the data, try to put your own stringent conditions of defining a farmer, and then try to do the analysis. You will get a totally different picture and a more realistic picture of the thing. But if you look at the survey reports and try to conclude it, you might not find a very useful picture, especially when it comes to modern technology and other things. You ask somebody who has a very small patch of land, as farmer, rural household or farmer household, he won't be or she won't be concerned with the technology and other things. So such kind of questions doesn't give you much useful data. So my advice was to the researchers is basically try to form your own definition and try to see whether the data can be modified to that extent. So this creates a lot of problem in identification of farmer and farmer households. So that is all I wanted to tell you basically in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for this essential advice to all researchers of agrarian issues in India. Over to Surajit.
Good morning, all. Thank you very much, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. I am also extremely grateful to FAS for accommodating my paper because it was not an easy decision. You can see my topic is somewhat not directly related to agrarian changes, of course, but it is related to poverty, inequality, unemployment, and social sector expenditure, and so on. So that way it is somewhat related. In fact, I am going to argue pretty much the same thing which Jayan is arguing, but my data set is cross-country, so it's multi-country analysis, and I have used little bit of econometric, very basic econometric techniques. I would not go into the detail of that, but I'll show you some evidence emerging from the existing secondary data. So, yeah, whenever there is a discussion on fiscal policy, the first thing which comes on the table is fiscal deficit and public debt. In fact, I did my PhD on fiscal deficit and public debt. So that is the main concern, not in the left circle or left of the center circle, but definitely in the policy making circle in most of the countries nowadays. So when I say fiscal policy for human development, I don't see that one of the main objectives or the sole objective of fiscal policy should be human development. That is not the purpose of this paper to argue this. However, I am trying to, it's an assertion. I think that one of the main objectives definitely of fiscal policy definitely should be human development. It's not changing. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so quickly let us look at the data. UNDP Human Development Index, this is taken from Human Development Report of 2025, the latest data. So we know that there are very high human development countries, high human development, medium human development countries, and low human development countries. As far as India is concerned, it is somewhat now, it is considered to be in between medium human development and high human development. The same situation, the red bar is for South Asia. Basically, it's similar to India. However, if we look at the geographical spread of human development, Arab states, you can see their human development is relatively less than East Asia and Pacific, and again that is less than Europe and Central Asia, and of course OECD countries have the highest human development. The world average is at 0.76, and the range of human development runs from 0.4 to almost 1. There are three components of this. Three components of UNDP Human Development Index. There are a lot of debates whether human development is a loaded term, whether UNDP Human Development Index can capture it or not. But the assumption, I needed data for empirical analysis, so I had to depend on this. The assumption, underlying assumption is that however you measure human development, that would be positively closely correlated with UNDP Human Development Index. Many people, including Professor Amartya Sen and others, have argued that. So they have three components: life expectancy of birth, which represents health indicator of the different countries. So here also we see similar patterns, both geographically as well as according to HDI values, that with high HDI countries, life expectancy at birth is generally higher, If you are born in sub-Saharan Africa, your life expectancy is less than 65 years on an average. And if you are born in, of course, one of those OECD countries, it is on an average more than 80 years. If we look at the mean years of schooling, that also varies widely, country to country, region to region, and according to more or less in the same order of Human Development Index, that higher Human Development Index countries are also found with higher mean years of schooling and so on. India is somewhere in the middle, world average at 8.8. However, India is lower than that. It's around 7 years of schooling. The third component of UNDP Human Development Index is per capita GNI, which of course runs from more than 50,000 US dollars. This is comparable US dollar in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms. 2021 purchasing power parity human, as compared to that in sub-Saharan African countries and least developed countries, it is below $5,000 per annum per head, and in India it is somewhere around $9,000 per annum per head. So the world average is a little more than $20,000 per annum. Therefore, there is a pattern that the richer countries have higher mean years of schooling, higher, better health indicators also, and therefore overall HDI is also expected to be better for the richer countries. And this is well-known fact, this is nothing new, but what is new is these things. If we plot inequality, inequality is, it shows a reverse trend. For the higher, very high and high human development countries, inequality in income distribution is comparatively much lower as compared to the medium and low human development countries. And in India, it is quite high, 37%. This is in percentage terms. The scale is not from 0 to 1, it's from 0 to 100. So, and the world average is 30. As compared to that, in India and South Asia, the inequality is much higher. Of course, in sub-Saharan Africa and least developed countries, it is even higher. And if we look at gender inequality, it shows the same trend that as inequality shows, that with higher and higher human development, gender inequality comes down, or vice versa. And also, gender inequality is quite high in this part of the world. It is 0.46 in South Asia, 0.4 in India, according to their measurement of UNDP Human Development Report. So, now, when I talk about this fiscal policy for human development, the major debate which I came across is basically the fiscal conservatives say that you have to reduce fiscal deficit. In order to do that, you have to reduce government expenditure, and given your tax revenue, government expenditure cannot go up beyond a point, because then fiscal deficit would go up, which is necessarily bad for the health of the economy and so on. And the other side of argument, the left of the center economists, they always argue, people like me and Jayan and many others, that social sector expenditure is important, social sector expenditure should be enhanced, and that would give you, social wage and so on and so forth. So within International Monetary Fund, Vito Tanzi was the director of fiscal policy affairs in IMF. He was arguing that in 2005, long back, 20 years back, that smaller size of the government is better for our future in general. At the same time, within fiscal policy department of IMF, Sanjeev Gupta and others, they were arguing pretty much in the same time that social sector expenditures of government are important for human development. So basically, effectively, what they mean is there should be a reduction in the government size as proportion of GDP. On the other hand, the social sector expenditure should be enhanced. Therefore, the composition of government expenditure should be changed in favor of the social sector. That's what I conclude from here. Although all other government expenditures are equally important on infrastructure, on even defense, on other things and so on. So, an interesting paper recent paper 2024, Cho and Lee, they argue that fiscal expansion has more significant positive effects on output and employment in countries with large governments despite existence of relatively high tax rates. So if the government size expands despite high tax rates, it is good from the point of view of output and employment. And our undergrad level popular textbooks like Dornbusch and Fisher, we all have read. Whether you like it or not, they have enormous impact on the policy making all over the globe. So this Dornbusch and Fisher says that there would be crowding out of private investment if fiscal deficit goes up. Your Frederick Mishkin says that money banking and finance, that it would lead to inflation if your fiscal deficit is high, and so on and so forth. So sorry. Yeah. So the mainstream textbooks continuously are teaching, undergrad textbooks, that fiscal deficit is necessarily bad for the health of the economy. This is again Mankiw, Ball and Mankiw since 1995. They are arguing that higher fiscal deficit can lead to inflation, future tax burden, crowding out, increased uncertainty, and so on. However, heterodox school, post-Keynesian school, they don't believe that the fiscal deficit would be necessarily bad for the health of the economy. It depends on the state of aggregate demand. So there is a debate and stakes are high. Esther Duflo, interestingly, in 2012 argued that there could be two-way causality between economic development and gender development. So economic development may lead to relatively less gender inequality, and at the same time relatively less gender inequality may lead to economic development as well. So however, this paper, this is also one of the recent papers which argue that austerity measures, that is shrinking of government size and so on, austerity measures risk jeopardizing the progress towards gender equality by undermining important employment and social protection programs and putting gender equality policy onto a back burner. So basically, gender women component plans, gender budgeting, they are all taking a back seat because of this fiscal conservatism. There is this direct versus indirect tax. This is also an important area. We know direct taxes are progressive taxes, indirect taxes are regressive taxes, but worldwide there is emphasis is being put on VAT or GST or some kind of indirect taxes rather than direct taxes. However, this is one interesting paper by Liu and Martinez-Vanquez, who argue that if the proportion of direct tax relative to indirect tax increases, it's an empirical paper, multi-country, increases, then it is good from the point of view of inequality, inequality reduces, but bad for the point of view of growth, because I mean, if direct taxes are too high, then saving by the rich would come down and that would not be reinvested. So basically neoclassical paradigm. One of my students, we are working together, Poonam Bamel, she has tested with panel data of multi-country and many years and concluded last year, the paper was published, the direct to indirect tax ratio is negatively associated with income inequality in a statistically significant manner. So this result is quite clean result, clear result, and reduction in income inequality is important for human development. So the question of decentralization, ma'am, how much time do I need? 6 minutes, okay. So the question of decentralization, some people say that decentralization may increase disparities, may jeopardize stability, and may undermine efficiency. However, Kerala experience, of course, Professor Thomas Isaac and K.N. Harilal, they have opined during People's Plan campaign of 1997. The campaign for the 9th plan of Kerala represents an initiative to make use of the legacy of collective social intervention and the strength of the mass movement to meet the contemporary crisis of development. So this is as far as local body finance is concerned, but as far as center and state finances, that is also one kind of decentralization is concerned. Professor Y.V. Reddy says the complex issue of reducing inequalities in development among states should be addressed by the cooperative efforts of both union and state on several policy fronts, as this should be a matter of national concern. So some people are arguing that decentralization is not necessarily good. Some others are saying that local governments are closer to people, so it's better to go for decentralization. And Y.V. Reddy says that even state finances are extremely important for development. Now, the whole debate boils down to this neoclassical versus post-Keynesian arguments. So it's basically the idea of sound finance comes in the way of all developmental spending that we can think of. And one of my friends, Anumitra Rai Chaudhary, wrote a book in 2018 on this labor laws and the counter arguments to labor laws. And he has actually shown that when the labor share or share of wages in the society, as Jayan was also arguing wage-led growth and so on, share of wages comes down in the society, it affects human development. And collective bargaining power of higher wages and that for social safety nets in both formal and informal sectors of the economy depend on the labor rights. So it is important to protect the labor rights, but at the same time, the demand for labor market flexibility is also very high all over the globe. So Mikhail Kaleski in 1971, we all know, says that a redistribution of income in favor of the profit earners is good from the point of view of neoclassical economists, but a larger share of wages should be considered to be desirable for the post-Keynesian economics. I refer to Mikhail Kaleski. I mean, Amit Bhaduri taught us macroeconomics, so wage-led growth and so on. Now, these are the variables under consideration. Quickly, I'll go through my results. There are 12 variables are under consideration. Data is taken mainly from UNDP, IMF, International Labour Organization, and World Bank, this worldwide governance indicator. I have taken one indicator, voice and accountability, that is voice of media and accountability of the government. And this poverty is working poverty rate. It is taken from ILO stat. This is basically percentage of employed living below 2.15 PPP US dollar, PPP 2021 US dollar. So that way poverty is defined. And country to country differences are wide. Due to lack of time, I am not going into the details of this, but if we look at the range of these variables, they vary quite widely country to country. The countries where it is maximum and the countries where it is minimum, there also there is a pattern. You will see that European countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, they have maximum things in almost everything. And as far as sub-Saharan African countries are concerned and some of the Arab countries, they have minimum of everything. So that's the geopolitics that is. Now, as far as the results are concerned, quickly for 80 countries, we have got this result taking human development indicator as the dependent variable. All the results are statistically significant, etc. Income inequality is giving a negative significant coefficient. That is, as inequality goes up, human development comes down. Not unexpected. With voice and accountability, if voice and accountability indicator improves in some country, it is positively closely related to human development index of a country in general. Fiscal decentralization. Fiscal decentralization, I have defined the total spending by subnational governments divided by total government spending of all kinds of governments in the country. So if fiscal decentralization goes up, then human development improves. We have got a statistically significant result. And of course, with log of per capita GDP, there is a positive significant effect, that is richer countries will have better human development index. So even after controlling for the impact of per capita GDP on the human development index, the other variables are giving us statistically significant result. In the second regression, this is for 76 countries, inequality is the dependent variable. If we want to explain inequality in terms of unemployment, poverty and gender inequality, then they give a statistically significant result. The third result, of course, we haven't got data for too many countries, only for 25 countries. There was some heteroscedasticity, but these are heteroscedasticity robust standard errors which are being reported. It shows that poverty rate of, variance in poverty rate country to country, working poverty, are closely associated with social sector spending of government. This is defined as total expenditure on social sector divided by total government expenditure. So if governments prioritize social sector spending, which Jayan was also arguing, then poverty rate, working poverty rate comes down. And even after, of course, per capita GDP has a positive effect, but even after keeping aside the impact of per capita GDP. And this is the last result, that is per capita GDP or per capita GNI is dependent positively closely with wage share of wages in total value added, and direct to indirect tax ratio, which I was talking about. So if direct to indirect tax ratio increases, then per capita GDP improves, and current account balance of GDP, that is the trade surplus. So with trade surplus, we are getting positive significant result. Therefore, from these four results, the conclusion which is quite obvious, I don't want to repeat all these things, I don't have time, but the direction of fiscal policy should be according to it, so that we can ensure a better world in future. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Surajit. We have about 6 minutes for Q&A, so yeah, I think the questions can be directed to all three, but with a preference for the two speakers who haven't had an opportunity to discuss their work. Yeah.
To PC Mohanan, who presented on data systems for measuring rural and agrarian change. My question is about the availability and the usage of data on agro industries, agribusiness firms, especially small firms, because that are central to driving a big chunk of change in the countryside. But since there is a lack of sound data material on this, and even more lack of analysis of whatever limited data is available on this, these aspects are much less studied, leading to some kind of understanding that rural and agrarian change is all about land and production, which it is, but equally important are the processes of commercialization, exchange, rural industrialization, which because of lack of comprehensive data available on these issues. So I'd like to know your thoughts on this. Thank you.
At a macro level, the kind of definition we use for this agriculture households or rural households, there are issues in that, the findings may not come out well. So my suggestion was that one should try to pick out the data according to some criteria that you develop. Especially even the rural, when you talk about rural households, urban households, the rural-urban binary is what is given by the census. And the census, for example, uses the previous census data. So for 2011 census, rural-urban census towns are decided based on the 2001 census data. And now the next census will actually use the 2011 data for defining what is a rural and what is an urban area. And now we are almost 2016 now. So there will be a 17-year kind of gap when the new rural-urban comes out. So that will also change some of your findings of the thing, because when you say rural household, the number will, when the census towns are introduced, all these numbers will change actually. That may not actually show a decline in many of those it's because of the definitional kind of thing, because the rural urban area is defined by places which has got a density of 4,000 kind of thing, then 80% of the workers are actually from the non-agriculture. That factor comes from the census data. So that is why when you do this new rural-urban binary after the census in 2007, 27 or 28, we don't know, many of these issues will again get changed. So you might have look for a new kind of arguments to support some other thing. So that is my suggestion. I mean, that is where I always give more importance to some of the micro studies like the FAS is doing when it comes to agriculture studies. You know, the macro studies does not tell you the whole story, but the micro studies, which is actually concentrated when where you use your own input and understanding, that gives you a very more realistic picture than what comes out of this because of some of these issues on this classification and criteria. I'm not very sure whether that was what you were asking, but yeah, it was.
Implemented regression, in your regression, have you implemented regression to country level standard error? To like, have you done anything to curtail the country level standard error? Because in most of the countries, they suffer from a particular kind of shock, right? So
This is cross section, not time series.
yes, still different countries have different level of shocks and yeah, I got it. So it is average data, not the unit level data, right?
This is cross-sectional data,
Yeah.
not unit level, of course.
Okay. And my second question is, Mohan sir, in NSSO, there is a division like who is the head of household, whether it is a female-headed household or male-headed household. But in description, nothing is given, or the concept that how the head of the household is determined, whether it is just because of age or such things are not clear in any of the NSSO report of situation assessment.
No, that who is the head of the household. Though he may not be earning, he or she may not be earning, or he may not be deciding the thing, but generally our system is that, so we just, whoever is reported there is no criteria kind of thing. Whoever the household admits that he is the head of the household, we do that. So there is no criteria for specifically identifying.
Yep, please go ahead.
Then how do we see the case of countries like, say, Brazil and China, which have in 2000 seen significant increasing public investments and also growth, but we see that there's also persistence of very high inequalities in both the countries. So how do we explain that?
Yeah, there could be exceptions, but in general these results are true. That's why the fit is also quite high. So there could be some exceptions, but in general these results are true for 80 countries.
So we need to wrap up, but I'm differences and take it as irreconcilable. And for Surajit, I have a suggestion perhaps that because we are talking about public versus private and crowding out and crowding in, maybe you could also test that formally by putting private investment as a function of all of the characteristics you look at and have public investment there, so you see whether there's a relationship. Over to you. The definitions of farmers, operation holdings, should we not even try to reconcile these differences?
That's okay. That's right, because the whole issue which I was mentioning is that in terms of numbers is very difficult to reconcile. We tried and we discussed with the agriculture census people, there is no way. But the pattern is somewhat same. See, if you look at the percentage kind of pattern of different classes, those things are coming, or the tenancy things are coming. But reconciling the numbers, we have been doing, I mean, we have tried 30 years back, and now I don't think it's not going to help.
Yeah, ma'am, good suggestion, I take it, but country to country structures vary so much. For India, we developed one model. for 14th Finance Commission. Now the 16th Finance Commission is also using that from NIPFP. So there this function is there, private investment as a function of, among other things, public investment also to test crowding in. Thank you.
With that, and is there any, yeah, over to you, thank you.
Thank you to all the presenters for their interesting insights.